letter came on a Thursday. Ordinary envelopes didn't usually make Mamie feel anything, but this one was different. It was cream-colored, thicker than most, addressed in careful cursive that didn't look like bills or junk. It had a return address she didn't recognize: Joseph Langston III, Charleston, South Carolina. Her hands trembled before she even knew why. Seated in her worn armchair by the window, sunlight flickering through aged lace curtains, Mamie stared at it for a full hour before finally sliding a finger beneath the flap. She didn't open it like a woman expecting good news. She opened it like someone about to reopen a wound. Dear Ms. Mamie Crawford, my name is Joseph Langston III. I believe we may be connected by something difficult. I am the grandson of John Langston, the former owner of the Langston Cotton Plantation, located just outside your hometown. I have recently come across documents, letters, and oral histories that suggest our families are tragically intertwined. I would like to speak with you in person. I understand how strange and unsettling this must be, but I believe that for both of us, and for those before us, this conversation needs to happen. Please consider it. With respect, Joseph Langston III. Mamie let the letter fall into her lap. For a long moment, all she could hear was the hum of the old fan in the corner and the creak of the house settling. Then her eyes drifted across the room, landing on the photograph that had never moved from the mantel. Her father in uniform, staring out with eyes so sharp they still pierced her. Her father who never spoke of what happened on that land. Her father who walked like he carried more than just his own weight. Langston, she whispered, the name bitter on her tongue. It wasn't just a letter. It was a knock on a door she'd kept locked for 70 years. Mamie didn't respond right away. What was there to say? That she remembered stories from her father and grandmother whispered at night like ghost tales? That the name Langston was soaked in blood and memory? That her great-aunt had disappeared and was never found, last seen in the cotton fields of that cursed place? But curiosity isn't a polite guest, it presses. The next morning, she picked up her phone. Her hands moved slowly over the keypad as she called the number listed at the bottom of the letter. After 2 rings, a man answered. His voice was younger than she'd imagined, soft, educated, nervous. Miss Crawford, this is she. This is Joseph Langston. I didn't think you'd call. I didn't think I would either. They agreed to meet at her house the following week. Mamie hadn't let a white man past her front porch in over 30 years, not since the town council sent some smooth-talking consultant to discuss property value. That man had left red-faced and empty-handed, but this one was different. Not because she trusted him, God no, but because some part of her wanted answers. Some part of her still dreamed of her grandmother's screams. When the day came, she was dressed in her Sunday best, navy dress, pearls, and a pressed handkerchief. She sat tall in her chair, regal in her dignity. And when a modest gray sedan pulled up, she didn't flinch. She watched the man get out, tall and clean-cut, holding a folder to his chest like a shield. He knocked twice, then waited. Mamie opened the door slowly. Her eyes met his, blue, earnest, unsure. You must be Miss Crawford. And you must be a Langston. He swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am. She stepped aside. Joseph entered like a man crossing a threshold he didn't deserve. He looked around her living room, visibly humbled by its age and warmth. Photographs of black children, weddings, and elders lined the walls. There was no sign of her husband, gone 12 years now, but his presence lingered in the chair he once claimed as his. Sit, Mamie said, gesturing to the couch. Tell me what brings the grandson of a plantation owner to my living room. Joseph opened the folder with shaking fingers. Inside were old black and white photos, yellowed papers, a copy of a death certificate. My grandfather died last year, he began. He left me everything, including journals, letters, ledgers, things I never knew existed. Mamie's lips pressed into a line. I imagine there's a lot y'all never knew. He nodded. I found letters between my grandfather and a man named Reuben Crawford. Your father, I think. The name hit like thunder. My father never mentioned that, she said. He didn't seem like he had a choice. The letters were one-sided. My grandfather wrote to him for years, apologizing, explaining, begging. Mamie sat back. Begging for what? Joseph met her eyes. Forgiveness. The room fell into silence, heavy and aching. I don't know what he did, Miss Crawford. But from the tone of those letters, he knew it was unforgivable. And yet, he kept writing. Mamie stood up and walked to the mantel. She picked up the photo of her father and stared at it. My father left South Carolina at 17, joined the Army, never looked back. He never spoke of the Laystons, not once, not even when his hands would shake holding that bottle, not even when he called out names in his sleep. Joseph lowered his gaze. I was raised to believe we were proud landowners. My grandfather told stories of dignity, legacy, tradition. But reading those letters, that wasn't dignity. It was guilt and grief. Mamie turned to face him, her voice low and steady. You want to know the truth? He nodded. Then you'll take me there, to the plantation, to the land where my blood was spilled. Joseph blinked. Of course. But why? Because if you really want to understand, it's not in the letters. It's in the soil. She stepped closer. You want forgiveness? You better be ready to walk where your people buried it. The next morning, the sky was gray with the weight of unspoken things. Joseph arrived exactly on time, his sedan idling quietly in Mamie's driveway. She stepped out wearing a dark overcoat, wide-brimmed hat, and a scarf tight around her chin. She carried no purse, no bag, just a worn Bible tucked under one arm. Joseph stepped out and opened the passenger door for her. You don't have to do that, she said, climbing in without looking at him. I want to, he replied, gently. The silence that settled between them wasn't hostile. It was sacred, like neither one wanted to speak until the road did. The drive out of town was long, the roads narrow and flanked by cypress trees and wild grass. Mamie hadn't seen this stretch of land in over 60 years, yet her body remembered it. Her stomach turned at every bend, her spine tightened with every familiar signpost. Joseph stole glances at her as he drove, his hands tight on the wheel. My grandfather used to take me fishing out here, he said quietly. I never knew what was on the other side of the road. Mamie spoke without turning her head. That's how it works. Y'all fish one side while we bury our dead on the other. They passed a rusted sign. Langston Cotton Plantation, Est 1842. It was cracked and nearly hidden behind weeds. The gravel road leading in had once been lined with white stones, but now it was uneven and half swallowed by nature. Mamie's breath caught in her throat as the house came into view. The plantation house stood still and stoic, its white columns stained by rain and time. The shutters sagged, the paint peeled, but its presence was undeniable, like a monument to something nobody should be proud of. This is it, Joseph whispered. Mamie didn't answer. She was already back in a memory. She could hear the creak of her grandmother's porch rocking chair, smell the faint sweetness of molasses, bread, baking, feel the hard-packed dirt of the fields beneath her bare feet. As Joseph parked the car, Mamie reached into her coat and touched the photo she had brought. a faded picture of her grandmother and great-aunt standing in front of a wooden cabin. "Where were the quarters?" she asked. Joseph looked around. "Back near the woods, I think. Most of them were torn down in the 60s. Torn down or buried?" Joseph winced. "I don't know." Mamie stepped out of the car. "Then it's time we find out." The air shifted as they walked. The ground, once flat from thousands of footsteps, was now wild with grass and bramble. Mamie walked slowly but firmly, her cane stabbing the earth with purpose. Joseph followed, silent, letting her lead. They came to a flat clearing where the cabins once stood. Only a few stones remained, foundation ghosts. Mamie looked around, eyes narrowed. "My grandmother was born here. So was her sister. They worked these fields long after the chains were gone, because chains change shape, but they don't disappear." Joseph knelt beside one of the stones. "I want to understand." "Really?" Mamie's voice was sharp. "Then stop looking with your eyes. Listen with your blood." They stood in the silence of history. Wind rustled the tall grass like voices. Crows circled overhead. Mamie closed her eyes and began to hum, a melody her grandmother used to sing while washing clothes in the creek. It was low, mournful, a tune that curled through the air like smoke. Joseph listened, feeling something deep and unsettled stir within him. "Do you hear that?" Mamie asked, eyes still closed. "I think so." "No, not the wind, not the birds, them." She pointed to the earth. "They remember. The ones who never got a name. The ones who disappeared." Joseph swallowed hard. "There's a cemetery behind the house. My grandfather kept it locked. Said it wasn't safe." Mamie's eyes flared. "Not safe for who?" He didn't answer. She turned and walked toward the trees. The cemetery was barely visible. A crooked fence, vines choking the gate. A sign dangled from one hinge. "Colored section." Mamie's jaw tightened. She pushed open the gate, and it groaned like a warning. Inside were a dozen headstones, most unmarked, some with initials carved by hand. At the far end, a cross leaned against a tree, splintered, half buried. Mamie dropped to her knees beside it. "This is where she is," Mamie whispered. "Who?" "My great-aunt Rosa. They said she ran away, but my grandmother knew better. Said she was taken, used, killed." Joseph looked at the cross. "There's no name." "Doesn't need one," Mamie said. "Her name's in my bones." She took a shaky breath. "My grandmother used to come out here with flowers, even when they told her it was trespassing. She'd kneel right here, talk to Rosa like she was still listening." Maybe she was. Joseph stood behind her, overwhelmed. "I'm so sorry." Mamie turned, her eyes sharp. "Don't be sorry. Be accountable." They stayed there a long time, surrounded by wind and ghosts. When they finally walked back to the car, neither spoke. Joseph helped her into the seat, then circled around to the driver's side. Before turning the key, Mamie spoke. This land was paid for with tears, with babies lost in childbirth, with men whipped for looking up, with women used up like they were nothing. "I know," he said. "You don't. But you're learning." She turned to him. "You want to make it right?" "Yes." "Then don't let this be the end. Let it be the beginning." Joseph nodded, jaw clenched. "It will be." They returned to town just before sunset. The air had changed, thicker, charged. Joseph dropped Mamie off at her house, but she paused before exiting. "Tomorrow," she said, "we're going to the courthouse." Joseph blinked. "Why?" "Because paper remembers what people forget." She stepped out before he could ask more, closing the door with a quiet finality. That night, Joseph couldn't sleep. He sat in his den, surrounded by old photo albums and documents his mother had left behind. He flipped through them like a stranger in someone else's life. One image stopped him, a black and white photo of a black man standing beside a barn. On the back, one word, Silas. Mamie met Joseph on the courthouse steps the next morning, wearing the same hat and coat. "You ready to look truth in the eye?" she asked. "I think so." The county clerk's office was sterile and bright. A young woman led them into the archives, her eyes darting nervously between them. "You're looking for land records, right?" "Among other things," Mamie said. They were led to a dusty room, with shelves sagging under the weight of ledgers, maps, and birth registries. The past smelled like mildew. Joseph opened a ledger labeled Langston Holdings, 1911 to 1938. Mamie found an old registry for colored workers, with entries written in shaky cursive. Joseph's hands trembled as he flipped through pages. His heart pounded. He stopped on a list dated June 1924. Dozens of names, most first names only, next to dollar figures and notations. Mamie stood over his shoulder. "That's not a payroll ledger," she said. "That's inventory." Joseph felt cold. "What do you mean?" "They weren't paying wages. They were calculating losses. See here. Rosa, age 16, ruined, $0 value." He stared at the line. "Ruined?" Mamie's voice cracked. "That's what they wrote when a girl got pregnant. By force." Joseph looked up at her, sick. "They kept records like this?" "They kept receipts for cruelty." They kept reading. Mamie found her grandmother's name, Delilah. Next to it, workable, no complaints, offspring, 3. Then a note in red ink. One girl missing, blame placed on Silas. Joseph froze. "Silas, that's the name on the photo I found." Mamie nodded slowly. "He was Rosa's friend. Some say he tried to protect her. Others say he ran." Joseph's breath was shallow. "My grandfather, he used to say Silas was trouble. Never explained why." Mamie pointed to the next page. "Silas, escaped. Property damage. Wanted." Joseph read it again. "Property damage," he whispered. "They meant a person." Mamie's hands balled into fists. "They always meant a person." The clerk returned. "Sorry, but we need to close up soon." Mamie straightened her coat. "We got what we came for." Outside, the sun was high, but the warmth did not touch them. Joseph leaned against the railing, stunned. "I don't even know how to carry this." "You don't carry it," Mamie said. "You sit with it. You let it burn you a little. That's how you make sure it never disappears again." Joseph looked out over the town square, the same one that once hosted heritage parades and Civil War reenactments. "I wonder what else this town forgets." Mamie gave him a look. "Everything it's ashamed of." They drove in silence for a while. Joseph finally spoke. "Do you believe in forgiveness?" Mamie took her time before answering. "I believe in justice first. Forgiveness can't bloom in soil that hasn't been tilled." Joseph nodded slowly. "Then what should I do?" "You listen. You document. And when it's your turn to speak, you tell the truth. Even when it's ugly. Especially then." They arrived back at Mamie's home. She turned to him before leaving. "Tomorrow, we go to the church." Joseph looked confused. "Church?" She nodded. "Not to pray. To remember." That's where the fire started. Then she went inside. and left him wondering what kind of fire she meant. That night, Joseph called his sister. "Do you remember anything about Grandpa and someone named Silas?" There was a pause. "Why?" "Just trying to understand," she sighed. "I remember Grandpa once said Silas got what he deserved." Mom changed the subject real fast. Said there were things better left buried. Joseph's stomach turned. "They were friends, weren't they?" "I don't know," she whispered, "but sometimes I think Mom carried guilt that wasn't hers." Joseph stared at the photo again. Silas looked tired but proud. Not dangerous, not like a man who deserved to disappear. He hung up and made a silent vow. "I will not let this stay buried." Early the next morning, Mamie greeted him on the porch with two things: a folded quilt and a mason jar full of dried lavender. "We're bringing them something," she explained. "Memory needs offerings." The church was small and wooden, half collapsed. Nature had reclaimed its edges. Ivy in the eaves, moss on the steeple. Mamie walked inside like it was still holy ground. She laid the quilt across a broken pew and placed the jar beneath the pulpit. "This used to be a praise house. Our people came here after work, after beatings, after loss. They sang until their voices cracked." Joseph stood near the doorway, unsure of his place. Mamie walked the narrow aisle, her cane tapping rhythm against the floor. "My grandmother led songs here," she said, "and one night Rosa came in crying, said someone important had taken her behind the barn." She turned to Joseph. "Guess who was important back then?" Joseph looked away, ashamed. "She wasn't the only one," Mamie added, "but she's the only one I carry every day." Joseph's voice was hoarse. "Can I carry her too?" Mamie's eyes softened. "If you're willing to carry the weight, not just the name." He nodded. "Then you already are." They stood together in the ruins, and for the first time, they felt the same silence. They left the church in silence. The weight between them wasn't heavy with discomfort. It was reverent, almost sacred. Joseph carried the folded quilt like it held more than just fabric. Back at Mamie's house, she motioned for him to follow her inside. The room smelled of cedar and lemon balm. She sat at the kitchen table and opened an old cigar box. Inside were letters, photos, and one small rusted key. "This belonged to Delilah," she said. "She gave it to my mama, and it came down to me. I never knew what it opened until I found the old barn cellar." Joseph looked up. "You went there?" Mamie nodded. "Once, but I wasn't ready." Mamie passed him a photo. A little girl standing beside a woman with dark, mournful eyes. Behind them stood the barn. "That's Rosa and Delilah," she said. "This was taken the week before Rosa disappeared." Joseph stared at the image. "Why keep this?" "To remember what they tried to erase." She pulled another letter from the box, yellowed and brittle, written in careful, uneven script. "Mama, I think he's going to kill Silas. He saw us, said he don't like his help getting ideas. I'm scared, Rosa." Joseph read it twice, then again. "Your grandfather," Mamie said quietly. "He saw them together." Joseph swallowed hard. "So he—" Mamie didn't answer. She didn't need to. Joseph stepped outside and sat on the porch, letter trembling in his hands. The sun was setting again. How could something so beautiful shine on a past so cruel? Mammy joined him after a while. "You okay?" she asked. "No," he said honestly, "but I want to be." She nodded. "That's a good place to start." He looked over. "Can I ask something selfish?" "Go ahead." "Why are you doing this with me? Why not someone else?" Mammy smiled sadly. Because you're the one who came back. And because I believe people can change, but not without knowing the full story. Joseph's throat tightened. I want to know all of it. The next morning, they drove back to the Langston property. The house loomed like a ghost. But their destination wasn't the house. It was the barn. The structure sagged, but still stood. Mamie led Joseph around to the side, where overgrown brush had mostly hidden a small hatch in the foundation. She handed him the key. You open it. His hands shook as he fit the rusted key into the lock. It turned with a heavy click. Inside, the air was thick with dust and time. A rickety staircase led down to a dirt floor. Mamie's cane clicked slowly behind him as they descended. The cellar was cold, lit only by a broken beam of sunlight through warped floorboards above. Joseph swept his flashlight across the room. It landed on a makeshift cot, chains bolted to the wall. Empty jars, scraps of cloth. Mamie stood still. They called this the quiet room. Joseph felt nauseous. They kept people here? Silas, for sure. Maybe others. When they ran, when they talked back, when they dared to love. Joseph dropped to his knees. God. He touched a groove in the wall, tallied marks, dozens of them, like someone counting days. Mamie lit a candle. He waited here, and no one came. Joseph sat on the cold floor, overwhelmed. How could they? Mamie placed the candle on a stone ledge. Because they could, and because no one made them stop. He looked up at her. Did you ever think about burning this place down? Mamie laughed bitterly. I did, but fire can't change memory. It just makes ashes. She knelt beside him. What we do right now, this is more dangerous than fire. We remember, we speak, we don't flinch. Joseph nodded slowly. Then I won't flinch. They left the cellar in silence. But something had shifted. The ghosts weren't louder. They were seen. That night, Joseph returned to his hotel and opened his laptop. He started writing. He didn't edit. He didn't polish. He just wrote. He told Rose's story. Silas's, Delilah's, Mamie's, his own. He wrote about what he'd learned, about the names he'd read in ledgers, about the lies families tell to survive. He wrote about the church, the chains, the tally marks on the wall. And then he wrote about his grandfather. He ended the piece with a question. What do we owe the dead who haunt us? Not because they want vengeance, but because they were never given peace. He hit save and cried. The next day, Joseph drove to the town library. He met with the director and asked for a meeting room. I'd like to read something, he said, to anyone willing to listen. The librarian, a white woman in her 60s, narrowed her eyes. Is it about the past? Joseph nodded. Yes, all of it. She sighed, but then something softened. You'll have the big room. When he arrived that evening, Mamie was already there, in the front row. A few others trickled in, curious, cautious, black and white, young and old. Joseph stood at the podium, hands trembling. Then he opened his notebook and began. He read for 40 minutes. No one moved. Even the children sat still. When he finished, no one clapped. Instead, someone stood. An older black man near the back. I knew Silas, he said. He was kind. They said he ran, but I think he was taken. A white woman rose next. My grandmother told me never to ask about Rosa. She cried every time someone mentioned her. More voices followed. Names, fragments, pieces of a puzzle long buried. Mamie didn't speak. She just watched, like a witness to something holy. Joseph stepped back, his throat raw. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged. The room was still. When Joseph finished reading, he looked up. No applause, no immediate words, but the silence wasn't oppressive. It was filled with recognition, acknowledgement of a truth long buried beneath polite smiles and quiet whispers. The old man who had stood up earlier cleared his throat. I remember Silas too, he said softly. He didn't deserve what happened. But you, he paused, looking at Joseph. You've given us something important. Joseph nodded, swallowing. I didn't know how to say it until now, but it's not just for me. It's for everyone who never got to tell their story. Mamie stood beside him, her eyes glistening. It's for all of us. The crowd slowly dispersed, but many stayed behind to talk. The whispers that filled the room weren't of gossip, but of connections being made. People began to speak of names long forgotten, of lives stolen and erased by time. Joseph and Mamie stayed at the front, watching as the town's hidden truths began to surface, even if just a little. The librarian approached them. I never knew any of this, she said quietly. What do you want us to do with it? Mamie's response was simple. Tell the story again and again. Let the truth be louder than the lies. Later that evening, Joseph sat alone in his hotel room. His phone buzzed with messages, mostly from friends who had been following his journey through his blog and social media posts. He read one aloud to himself. Joseph, you've done something incredible. We need to keep talking about this. Don't stop. He put the phone down and looked out of the window at the stars. They seemed brighter tonight. Mamie had been right. Truth was a fire. It burned through the silence, and though it didn't fix everything, it cleared the way for something new. The next morning, Joseph returned to the Langston property with Mamie. The barn still stood, though time had done its work on it. But now it felt different. No longer just a place of sorrow, but a place of reclamation. Joseph walked through the threshold, feeling the weight of every step. He paused in front of the cellar entrance. Do you ever think about what you could have done? He asked Mamie. She stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on the old wood. Every day. But what matters is what we do now. The past is ours to remember, but the future is ours to shape. Joseph took a deep breath. We'll make sure no one forgets. Joseph returned home to a quieter life, but it was no longer the same as before. His writing was different, more focused, more urgent. He began work on a book about his journey, about the town, about the stories of people like Silas, Rosa, and Delilah. His first chapter started simply, this is a story about a town, a man, and a history that was never meant to be told. But the truth doesn't belong to the dead, it belongs to the living. He submitted the manuscript with no expectation of fame or fortune, but with one simple desire, to make sure that the names lived on. The town, too, began to change. The old courthouse that had once been a symbol of oppression now hosted gatherings on history, on reconciliation, on the stories that had been silenced for too long. The Langston property was turned into a memorial, an education center, a place to learn, remember, and listen. Mamie, though older now, stood proudly at its opening ceremony, a living testament to resilience. Joseph stood beside her, his hand on the shoulder of the boy next to him, the son of a friend whose great-grandmother had been a survivor of the same terror. "Remember this," Mamie said, looking out at the crowd. "Remember the voices that never got to speak, and let us be the ones to carry them." Years passed. Joseph continued to write. The book became a symbol, but not the one he had expected. It wasn't about fame, it was about truth, and the quiet, stubborn determination to honor the past without being swallowed by it. He continued to visit the town, and every time he returned, the feeling of redemption deepened. The faces in the crowd were different, but they shared something, an understanding that the weight of silence had been broken. And in that silence, they found their voices. One night, Mamie invited Joseph back to the church, the place where everything had begun. The pews had been restored, and the air was filled with a different kind of reverence now. It was no longer a house of ghosts, but a place of healing. They sat together in the front row, and for the first time, the story of Silas and Rosa was told not in hushed tones, but with pride. Mamie turned to Joseph. "You did what needed to be done. You broke the silence." Joseph smiled, his eyes tired but satisfied. "I didn't do it alone." Mamie nodded. "We never do." They sat in silence for a long while. The sun began to set outside, casting a warm golden light through the stained glass windows. And in that quiet moment, both of them understood. The past could never be erased, but it could be understood. And in understanding, there was peace.